Many unbearable hours later. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. Moments later. Montage. More moments later. Much later. Much later. Much later. Much later. One debt to society later. One eternity later. One extremely annoying shift later. One frozen wasteland later. 1 hour later. 1 hour later.
1 hour later!
1 hour later. One long angry line later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. One pair of pants later. 1 semester later. 1 shift later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 winner later. Opening night. Several bad puns later. Several days later. Several months later. Several song-filled hours later. 6 hours later. 6 hours later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Soon after. The following day. The following Thursday. The next day. The next day. The next day. The very next evening. The next morning. The next morning. The next morning. The next morning. Thousands of tears later. 3 days later. 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
3 hours later. 3 weeks later. 3 weeks later. Tomorrow for sure. Tomorrow. 2 hours later. 12 seconds later. 20 minutes later. 24 hours later. 2 days later. 2 hours 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 later. 2 very boring minutes later. 2 weeks later. Yesterday. 2 hours later. 3 days later. 3 days later. 3 days later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. 3:28 a.m. 4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 5 hours later. 5 minutes later. 6.5 hours later. 6 months later. 7 hours later. 7:59 a.m. 8 hours later. 8:01 p.m. 10 seconds later. 12 o'clock midnight. 15 minutes later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 24 hours later. 48 hours later.
70 years later.
72 hours later. 75 years later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 82 kilometers later. 298 frozen patties later. 346 minutes later. 2,000 years later. 3,000 years later.
A few inches later.
A few minutes later. A few moments later. A little later. A little longer than a few minutes later. A lot of boring math later. Approximately 10 hours later. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. By sheer coincidence. Day 4, day 3, day 2. Early the next morning. 8 hours later. 11 minutes later. End of flashback. Epilogue. Epilogue. Eventually. 5 minutes later. 5 minutes later. Flashback. Graduation day. Just then. Just then. Later that same evening. Later. In the void. Later. 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 Many hours later. Many months later. Many tic-tacs later.